Well, let me say this. I don't know if you've ever been just looking through pockets in a coat, and all of a sudden you're looking for keys or a receipt or something, and all of a sudden you find money. Yeah, that's never happened to me either. But I've heard of people that has happened to, and they're really excited when they find that. In fact, somebody was at our house the other night, and they were talking about how they find money in a cookbook, right? Was it cookbook? Yeah, cookbook. I'm like, man, who knew that those things actually had some worth? Ours, no, maybe I shouldn't say anything. That's just going to get me in trouble later. So, good plan. All right, let's skip to this. So there are times, though, when you are looking for something and you get excited because you find something even better. Well, let me share with you some things that have happened in the past where that's exactly what's happened. So there was a soap company that was tasked with finding a method of cleaning wallpaper of coal residue. So we're not talking about something here recent. It was accumulating at Kroger stores, and so they were looking for something that could clean that. And what they ended up doing was they found this non-toxic, reusable modeling kind of compound, and that before World War II, then people were all of a sudden starting to move from coal to natural gas, and all of a sudden this wasn't useful anymore. And so this company was about to go bankrupt until they found out that little kids like to play with it. So they took out the cleaning compound that was in it, added some different colors to it, and they called it Play-Doh, right? So, number one, Percy Spencer, who is a self-taught engineer, was working with radar technology, and when working for Raytheon and inspecting a magnetron, somebody can tell me what that is later, he noticed something strange that, not necessarily with the machine itself, but something strange in his pocket, because he had a candy bar in his pocket and it started to melt. And so what he discovered and what he created then was the first radar range, or microwave as we call them. First food he tested, popcorn, right? One last discovery. So a Scottish scientist, Alexander Fleming, was working on treatments for the flu. And after coming back from a 2-week vacation, he found mold had developed on one of his staph cultures. Upon further review, he found that the bacteria wouldn't grow around or near the mold. So he accidentally, probably even in a moment of sloppiness, discovered penicillin. And so he was looking for one thing and found something even better. And this is exactly what I think of when I think about the story of the Magi, the wise men from the East. People who were looking for one thing, but they found something. They found someone who was so much more than what they were seeking at first. And so I want to look at this story maybe with some fresh eyes, if we can, as we look at Matthew 2. Thank you for reading that for us here a little while ago, Jeff. But I want us to look, first of all, at this announcement of the king. And as we look at the announcement, look how Matthew just does this. He has the simplicity of the announcement. He literally just says, after Jesus was born, right? Now, I don't know about you, what your traditions are. Our Pettit family, I realize, and my kids are all grown, and I wish we would have actually probably had a few more traditions. We weren't necessarily a family that created a lot of different traditions, but certainly one that we had was on that Christmas morning, certainly before we would dive into presents, we would always read the Christmas story. Now, I'll be honest with you, we would read through Luke, because Luke has more details that would go along with what we were going for that day. But for us here in Matthew, we simply are just told this: he was born. Matthew says it very matter-of-factly. He just says, this is truth. The truth is that Jesus was born. No use, no need for him to go through the details. He just tells the truth in a much simpler package. Jesus was born, very simplistically. There's the placement of the announcement, pretty important. He says it's in Bethlehem in Judea. Again, important to Matthew was the fact that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, not just any Bethlehem, but Bethlehem of Judea. Again, this is so important because it's the place that was foretold where the Messiah would come from. This is the place that so many years ago Samuel would anoint David with oil, the new king of Israel. And so Matthew is making very clear to each of us that this is no ordinary child. This child is the Messiah, the king. Interestingly, Bethlehem means house of bread, to which Jesus himself would call himself, among other things, the bread of life, the true manna that has come from heaven. Again, you see not just the simplicity of placement, but you also see the timing of the announcement. It says it's during the time of King Herod. So Matthew gives us somewhat of a time frame then for the birth of Jesus. Again, this is King Herod, but would be known as Herod the Great, who died at 4 BC. So Jesus generally would be born somewhere between 6, 7, maybe even as late as 5 BC. And so as we kind of look through the Luke account, kind of come up with those numbers. And so what that means is our calendars, yeah, they're a little off. That's okay. Heralds of the announcement, that he says this, Matthew says, Magi from the east. So this announcement of a king is further drawn out through the entrance of the Magi into the story. These men are traditionally been called wise men because they're seen as those who possess secret wisdom, insight into different things. And here in our passage here, certainly we could say that they certainly were some sort of astrologers, people who had gained special insight into the world's affairs through observations of the planets and the stars. And it says that they were from the east, probably, more than likely, from Babylon, where there was a large settlement of Jews dating all the way back to Daniel. And possibly, maybe that's even where they got some of their understanding for how this, how the matters kind of originate here from. What it certainly meant to come through this announcement is that they were announcing a king. That by the inclusion of the Magi from the east, that this is not just coming from Jews, but also from Gentiles. That the Gentiles, certainly throughout the Bible, you can see that they were those who many times were outside of the blessings of the Lord. But upon the Magi entering into the story, it really shows the receptiveness of their receptiveness to the newborn king and an openness for the purposes of God, revealing that this king is one that will go beyond the border markers on some sort of map, that he will rule not just on a map, but the entire world itself. And so this is quite the birth announcement. So much more than you get at maybe first glance, that this newborn is a king, not just any king, but the promised Messiah that will save the Jews, and yes, also the Gentiles, the world at large. What an announcement. And did I mention that there was a star in this as well? There's the uniqueness of this announcement. It says that we saw this star. That this announcement comes with some kind of astrological phenomenon. That all of a sudden a star appears and it informs them of the importance of the event that they were announcing and told them of the importance of the event, that there was the birth of a king. We don't know the specifics of the star, just the results, that they were given divine guidance in their quest to find this newborn king. In fact, it always takes divine guidance, doesn't it? That God seems to always, that he has to be the one who is the initiator for us in seeing him for who he is. Romans 3:11, right, tells us that none seek him. No, not one. God has to lead us. In our world today, it's easy to see people looking for something of significance. They just don't know where to look. Not until God opens up our eyes and our hearts and our minds to who he is. And so there is an announcement of a king in this passage. There's also a threat, the threat of a king. In Matthew 2:3 it says, when King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Matthew here says that King Herod was disturbed or troubled upon hearing that the king of the Jews had been born, and so the rest of Jerusalem along with him. The rest of Jerusalem might have been disturbed basically just upon hearing that King Herod was disturbed. This is the same guy who years earlier had killed the entire Sanhedrin. This is the same guy who killed his own family members. This guy didn't take threats to his rule in stride. And so in verse 4, you see him calling together a team of religious leaders to get additional information. It says, when he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. To be honest with you, the passage really isn't just saying that he gathered them one time. It's said in such a way that he kept on asking them to come back. Have you ever asked somebody something and all of a sudden they went away and you got your answers and you came up with another question and all of a sudden you went through the same process again? Well, he did that, it seems like, several times here. But in verses 5 and 6, we see an answer that they give to him. It's kind of a loose quote of Micah 5:2. And it says that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. And so in Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. And then verses 7 and 8 says, then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. Now that Herod has the location, he calls back the Magi and tries to gain a bit more information about when this child was born, to kind of pinpoint how old this child was. And so the exact time the star had appeared is what he was looking for, and tells them to make a careful search for this newborn king. And he conceals his motives from them and tells them the reason he wants to know is that he might be able to go and worship this king. Of course, Herod was threatened by this new king, even if he is only possibly 2 years old. These two couldn't be any more different from each other. Herod would have absolutely no framework from which to understand who Jesus was. And if I might just chase a rabbit here just for a second, but my wife is really into nativity scenes. And I'm just saying this about your nativity scenes. Maybe you should put the Wisemen a little further out from the actual manger, right? Since it took a bit of time for them to get there. But these guys point to the fact then here about the difference of who Herod was versus who Jesus is. And so we see these differences. Let me just quickly just give you three. And the first one is this, is in sacrifice. That all of a sudden when you see Herod the Great, he was someone he believed in sacrifice, and he would sacrifice anyone who would get in his way. Versus Jesus, who would sacrifice his own life to pay for our sin, that he would create the way, the only way that we might be right with God. Sacrifice, that there is a difference between their leadership. That all of a sudden you find Herod the Great is one who lords his authority over others. That he is out for his own good versus Jesus, who in verse 6, he's talked about as being the shepherd of his people, watching out for their safety, for their benefit, loving, caring, sacrifice, leadership. One last one, authenticity. That Herod the Great keeps his motives to himself, lies when he needs to, manipulates as he can, versus Jesus, who obviously makes this announcement to the entire world, that literally a star appears, that Jesus would then go on to live and eat and work and teach amongst the very people in which he would share his life with, that he would open up, that he would share the truth whether it was uncomfortable or not, that he would be who he is wherever he was. Question to you, which king do you relate to more? And before you give me the Sunday school answer, well, of course I'm more like Jesus. If I was to ask your kids, friends, spouse, co-workers, what would they tell me? Yeah, I get it. Herod was a horrible individual, and he certainly took things way beyond most could ever even think of, but he certainly represents the way in which our world works. He used people to get what he wanted. He put others down to lift himself up and only had his own well-being in mind when he was making decisions. He certainly was not one to walk in someone else's shoes. He would lie to shield himself from his real intentions and to protect his own interests. Yeah, these two couldn't be more different. You see, following King Jesus means a new way of life. This new king was a threat to Herod and his way of life, of doing things. This new king is a threat to all of us. His ways go against our own natural ways. Anyone who would choose to follow King Jesus will find a brand new life and a way in which to live that life. Jesus isn't someone that you just fit into a busy schedule. Following Jesus isn't about doing what you think best, but discovering what he thinks best and doing it even if you don't even understand why. Following Jesus is a journey, but he does give us a map, his word, the Bible, to direct our paths. He gives us the Holy Spirit to guide us, even empower us to stay on that path. This is such a different way of life than the way in which our world operates. And so there is a threat of the king, and there's also the worship of the king. In Matthew 2:9, it says, after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. So the Magi, having spoken with King Herod in the capital, make this 2-hour journey to Bethlehem, again, aided by God's hand through the star. And then verse 10 says, when they saw the star, they were overjoyed. Wow. Matter of fact, it literally, if I was to translate this kind of just word for word, it says, they rejoiced with a great joy exceedingly. Can I just say this? They were excited. They were excited that they finally, after this long journey from Babylon, had found the child, the promised one, from the star in which had directed them there. They were at their journey's end. And so God has revealed the birth of a new king to them. Somewhat miraculously, of course. They had made a long journey and then aided through this help of God, have found this king completely confident that the very child before them was the one that was promised at the very beginning of their trek. They were overjoyed. Mission accomplished. And in verse 11, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so we see their response here. Upon finding the king they sought, they simply bowed and they worshiped him. Now, this was not just bowing in humble reverence before a civil king. Certainly, this is the kind of king that they thought they were seeking out at the very beginning. I mean, they told Herod that they were looking for the king of the Jews, a regional king, a king of people, not all peoples. And yet, when they bow down and they worship the king, as they are presenting him with gifts, somewhere in there, their attitude must change. Because the word for presenting their gifts is only used 7 times in the New Testament. And each time that it is used, it is offering gifts to God. In this moment, there is some kind of recognition that the king that is before them is more than just any king, that they were looking for something, but they found something so much more in that moment. And so they present Jesus with these gifts. The word treasure here means caskets. It's kind of a receptacle for valuables. And so they opened up their treasure boxes, and there was gold and frankincense and myrrh. And Matthew doesn't provide us here for us, but was surely aware that the nations of the world, even this very region, would come and they would present gifts to a king. Even these gifts here are gifts that are in fulfillment of prophecy that you can find in Psalms or in Isaiah. If you're into decoding the meaning of the gifts, I offer you this, all right? Gold reflects Christ's kingship, frankincense his deity, and myrrh his suffering. And that's all I'll give you, because that's not really always what I move towards. What I'm more comfortable with saying is this, is that these gifts had great value. And they demonstrated the Magi's wealth and the importance that they gave to Jesus, even before they left their home to find this king who became more to them than what they thought. Of course, in God's providence, these gifts kind of explain, at least to me, how a family of meager means is able to live on the run in Egypt, to live outside the reaches of Herod in the coming days. And speaking of Herod, in Matthew 2:12 it says, "And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, the Magi, returned to their country by another route." You see, the Magi are once again given direction by God. This time, their route to take them home. They are not to be used by Herod as a pawn in his plan to remove the threat of the new king, but to leave the country without telling the location of the child and who specifically he is. The Wisemen found him to be more than they had reckoned for, worshipped him more than as if he was just a man, a regular king, but of the King of the world, of God. Did they get it fully? Did they truly understand who Jesus was? I'm not sure. What I do know is it's pretty unbelievable. These wise men, they didn't believe in a Savior for the world being born. They just believed that there was a new king for a country that was announced to them by a star. At least when they set out to find Jesus, that's what they believed. And it looks like they came to believe more than that. How much more? I'm unsure. Certainly that's up for debate. But the real question is this: do we? The real question is, do you? Do you believe? What is your response? Do you understand that he is a king? That he can be the king of your life? An announcement has been made, and the offer is real. The threat is real to you. If you want to follow this king, it means leaving your old ways and choosing to follow his. It means doing a 180. Is that what repentance is? Going in a different direction. It means bowing down before him and offering our gifts. I'm certainly not talking about money here. I'm talking about our very lives. That we wouldn't hold anything back from him, that we would commit our full lives to follow Jesus. You know, having followed Jesus for almost 40 plus years, you know what? I continue to be amazed. I continue to realize that he is more than what I think he is. I continue to find myself recognizing that Jesus is even hard to really completely comprehend at times. But for you today, if you can feel his tug calling you, inviting you to follow him, well, I'll tell you what, you've just received a whole lot more than what you've expected from coming to this service today as well. It is life-changing. It brings salvation. It is a brand new life, an eternal life. Right where we sit, right where you're listening from, you can choose not just to acknowledge that he is king, but you can choose to follow him and renounce your past, your sin, a life spent living for the wrong kingdom, and ask him to forgive you, because he will. Tell Jesus you believe he is king. Give your full, complete allegiance to him. And from this day forward, choose to follow him for his kingdom.